As mentioned, I'm with the City of Petaluma. My role is I am the Public Art Liaison, so I am staff to the Public Art Committee. I thought I would start by giving just a brief overview of the program for public art and an explanation of our roadmap to date. The Public Art Program in Petaluma is funded by private development in your community. It's 1% of non-residential development. So if you see a new bank building, a new clothing store, any type of non-residential use, that money goes into an in lieu fee fund that is for that purpose only. We had some questions last night about can the money be for other things. It's for public art. There are, in terms of the process, I wanted to say a little bit about how we got here and where we're going next. This process that we started with an RFP back in 2014, trying to find an artist for the Water Street area near the Boshaw Bridge to approximately Washington. There was two phases to that. The first phase was ultimately abandoned. The second phase was very deliberately chosen to identify an artist and an art piece and to work on with that artist in crafting an artwork with the community in a public process. Now that public process officially began in September of last year when Brian Goggin, the artist, was chosen among 67 candidates through the RFP process. Now that process included a lot of vetting. A lot of individuals applied. It was the committee, in addition to a stakeholder panel that consisted of members of your community, so business owners, operators, design professionals, just interested neighbors that live in your community, sat on a selection panel and vetted all of those and chose Brian. And he's here this evening after presenting a draft concept to the committee to get the community's feedback. So we have, prior to this date, listened to 2 community events down at the project site where we met, advertised, and had a very good turnout right at the base of the bridge there. Two afternoons, one in October, the end and one at the beginning of November of last year, where it was essentially a listening session. So Brian was there, the community came out and shared all of their hopes, their dreams, their fears of what this art piece could be. And from there, Brian took that information to craft a concept. That concept is in draft form here tonight. We're looking for your feedback. There are some comment cards I saw floating on chairs. If you would like to, in written format, offer some comments at any point before we leave tonight, there's a box on top of the pastry display case here. You can drop it in there. Share your thoughts. We'll look at them later. If you'd like to write me an email, my business cards are up there. Lots of folks have done so already today. Please send me an email with your thoughts. Just put Water Street Public Art in the subject line, and we'll make sure to get it to the committee and anyone else who's interested. So, in terms of format, I wanted to just explain that we're here for a presentation. If I could ask for you to please let Brian get through his presentation. You all have your own questions. I know, well, not maybe all, but some of you certainly do. There will be ample time for questions and answers, and there will be a dialogue. So you may pose a question, and Brian is here to answer it. If it's a city issue question, I can respond to that. We'll do our best to get all the responses out as able. Please keep hold that. We'll get to the questions sooner. And beyond that, in terms of next steps, if you are interested in remaining involved in this process, please keep in mind this is receiving feedback on the concept. That feedback will be taken into consideration at a committee meeting in May 24th, 6 p.m. at the Petaluma Public Art Center is where we always have our meetings. You're all welcome to come down. It's a public meeting. We look forward to seeing you there. I think with that, I will hand it over to Brian.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, John, for hosting, and for everybody for coming out tonight. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces As Kevin was saying, I had an opportunity to meet with many of you early on. Kevin, can we switch over to the other? Oh, sure.
Sorry. Thanks for the clapping. If that could be the last time we clap, just let's be neighbors. Clapping can be intimidating to your folks who have different viewpoints, so we can respect all viewpoints and let everyone feel as comfortable as possible. We greatly appreciate it.
We met back in November and in October a couple of times, and I had a chance to get an impression of what was important to people here in Petaluma, which helped give me a basis for various different directions that I could go in as I was researching options for this project. So what I'd like to do tonight is briefly go through my thought process as I was developing this concept, so you can kind of go on this imaginative journey with me, and you can see some of the influences that I took into consideration and struck my imagination as I was first introduced to the project, the site, the history, and the context. So Petaluma Magic really inspired me. It's a project that Amy Critchett and Creative Sonoma organized at Della Fattoria, and a number of local artists and non-artists got together and collaborated to depict what Petaluma, what is important to people in Petaluma. So I had a chance to have a window into that thought process following this project, and I was really struck by this image, the way Petaluma Magic comes up with these ideas: people, environment, town, art, love, universe, mobility, animals, generosity, invention, civility. So these were ideas that were floating in my imagination when I came to Petaluma and started meeting with folks to do research. Of course, I was struck by your natural beauty, your agricultural roots, and also your historic architectural downtown heritage and how that related to the development of this space from the Miwoks all the way up to the present day. And the labor that was involved in building this town, the myths, the stories that have stuck with the town and shaping its character. One of the things that struck me was how important it was to be in such close proximity to both the railroad and the river, where there was this relationship between both, and then also the downtown that was built right nearby. And the families that came to Petaluma seeking freedom to create a small business where they could support their family using these innovative techniques with poultry farming, but then how that expanded out into the character, what makes Petaluma today. Some of these ideas that came up and really stuck with me are transition to the future while honoring the past. So that helped me as I was starting to do research at the Petaluma Historical Library. The Petaluma River as a connection to San Francisco and the world. I like that idea. One of the people who showed up for the meeting was talking about how they felt that it was interesting that they could get on a boat here in Petaluma and make their way all the way to China. And so there's this international quality in Petaluma where I feel there's a great sophistication and awareness of what's going on around the world and dialogue that's going on between Petaluma and the rest of the world. And then create an artwork that encourages different thoughts and interactions, which is an area in art that I enjoy, and I think a lot of artists are interested in creating environments and projects that help create a context for reflection and for seeing things afresh. there's a lot of activity, creative activity that I can identify with here in Petaluma, where people are doing things themselves, they're building things themselves, they're not looking for people to prefabricate something necessarily for them, but instead they're creating culture, and I identify with that. We're not just another suburban town. Petaluma is like a Norman Rockwell painting on acid. Incorporate humor and playfulness. If you look at the body of work, I've been creating site-specific public sculpture for the last 30 years. If you look at my body of work, you can see there's a line of humor that kind of moves through the work. And it always comes with the greatest respect for the place where I'm creating work. I grew up in Davis, and I had an opportunity to see Christo's running fence created, and I saw the kind of dialogue that went around producing that piece and how communities came out for and against the project, but ultimately it created a dialogue bringing communities together to speak together about issues that might not have come up if an artist hadn't presented this interesting new way of working. And so I was struck by that, and the mud flat sculptures that many of you might have seen in Emeryville as a kid when I would go into town to take classes. So I'm trying to give you a context for some of these influences. The surreal qualities of this old photograph from a 1925 depiction of one of the Egg Day parades seemed to epitomize this local sense of humor to me, but then also how it's continuing to live on today. This photograph just taken over the weekend at your latest parade. It shows me that people are open to creating a scenario where people can enjoy themselves and have a sense of humor around serious subjects like electricity. And here, this sculpture created by Basil Ganglia, the artist is here tonight. I showed this last night as an example of very powerful, meaningful public art that also has a sense of humor. And so I was interested in developing a project that is linked to that tradition. But also some of these other ideas, connecting to considering the tides of the river, preservation of architecture, creating a destination to attract visitors both day and night. So considering the tides of the river, paying attention to the weather, paying attention to the context of the environment, preservation of architecture, looking at the unique heritage. What is the architectural unique heritage in Petaluma? In addition to the adobe, the Petaluma adobe, there's also the iron fronts that have become so important here in California. Some of the few examples of this kind of architecture that survived the 1906 earthquake. And then creating a destination to attract visitors both day and night. I can appreciate that for years the river was a central hub, and then after a while people turned away from the river and started developing buildings that faced the opposite direction. But now I understand there's an interest in revitalizing this space. And so I wanted to create a project that was open enough to allow for public gatherings, to enable the celebrations that you have, the water fights that you guys have on this plaza area, to still continue while also creating a piece of as large scale as I could afford with the given budget. The river is the heart of the town, and it's been feeding the town. There's been this interrelationship between Petaluma and the rest of the world through this river. It's connected San Francisco in a unique way, and because I'm currently living in San Francisco, I've been there since 1988, I feel like it's interesting to play a role in working with Petaluma, the city of Petaluma, that reminds me of the way that the iron foundries in San Francisco were working with the architects here in Petaluma to create buildings, cast them in San Francisco, and then transport them via ship up to Petaluma, and then construct your downtown. Here's a shot from, I think this is 1910, and this is one of the iron fronts, I believe. I did some research, considerable amount of research with John Fitzgerald over at the Historical Library here in Petaluma, and he helped guide me to a number of different books and also to various different people I could speak with, but also many photographs that were inspiring as I was developing the concept. But what kept coming back to me was this fascination with this process of creating these iron front buildings. I didn't know that these iron fronts were made in San Francisco and exported. I didn't realize how unique they were until I started digging into the research. But the iron fronts were originally thought to be resistant to fire and earthquake, and so they were very popular in the late 19th century. As many of you know, if you go to New York City and you go to Soho, a lot of those buildings are still iron fronts. They don't have a lot of earthquakes there. San Francisco was made up of the same kind of set of buildings, but most of those were destroyed in the earthquake. They stopped building that type of architecture after that. And so now in California, Petaluma's one of the few places that really has a collection of these beautiful buildings. And so I wanted to follow the journey of these buildings and see if I could find inspiration for a project for you. So here are a couple of shots of what it's like today in those buildings. And these are a few illustrations of some of the early examples of the buildings that were being constructed at the time Petaluma was being built. You could even go onto catalogs and start piecing together your building from prefabricated pieces. There were something like 20 or 30 different foundries in Oakland and San Francisco that were casting iron, and many of these were building these architectural gems. This is one of them. It's one of the smaller foundries. I was doing research in the San Francisco Public Library, and I found this one, as well as this safety shot of one of the workers in the foundry pouring molten iron, and with his cigarette to make sure that he's being totally safe and aware, just in case there might be too much smoke in the room. Look at that, not even a heat shield on. It's incredible. And they were very organized in their shops, as you can see, as they were building their architecture. This is an illustration showing, it's an artistic interpretation of them building these buildings and then carting off the various different elements. But you can imagine, as I was trying to piece together this story of what it was like to see these buildings pieced together and then broken apart and then brought up to Petaluma. This is a shot of the flood building that's downtown San Francisco, and it's showing the process of beginning to install the large cast iron elements on the exterior of the building. And when they were dismantling one of those buildings in San Francisco, this is a shot of them taking one of the elements down. This was the building that they were dismantling in the 60s. But your town came up one piece at a time on boats like this up the river to your downtown, and just that whole idea of the journey was fascinating to me. When I was a kid, one of my favorite films was Fitzcarraldo. Have any of you seen Fitzcarraldo by Werner Herzog? I just love this journey that the character in this story goes through. And I had a chance to spend time with Les Blank, who made this documentary about this whole process. And it's been a kind of mythological story that I have had recur in my imagination as I've worked on pieces. And so this whole idea of creating a sculpture that could potentially take the same journey that these buildings took seemed like an interesting possibility. So I wanted to design a project that was open to that. The architecture took its journey on a boat like this. This is one of the sailing scows with hay on it, but it would have had, in that case, of course, the goods that were used to create the architecture, and then offloaded onto this deck. And in many cases, the objects that were imported from the city were put onto trains and then trucked elsewhere. The trains and the history of the trestle also became a story that I was made familiar with. And as I spent time in the plaza, seeing how people were interacting with each other using this plaza, I noticed the state of the trestle system and how important it was to many people that this trestle be saved. And so I wanted to see if there was a way to incorporate the materiality of the wood of the trestle system into a design of a sculpture for you. So here's a shot of the kind of trestle system that was used to support the rail. And this is a shot of the site, I think in 1957, before it became a plaza, of course. And here today, okay, it's an artistic rendering. It's intended to kind of simplify the site so that I can show you what the piece looks like. But this was the site that I was really concentrating on, and the area that we were looking at was this space here, trying to avoid the rail pathway here in case the trestle system is revived and trains are able to travel these tracks again. So one of the things that I was asked to do was to design something that is not going to encroach on that area. The steamships, the various different ships, in addition to bringing up these elements of the iron fronts, were also bringing up household goods. They were bringing up elements that were used to build out people's kitchens, all of the furniture. Many of the things that weren't built here in Petaluma were coming up from San Francisco, including bathtubs that were cast in the same foundries that your buildings were cast in, the cast iron claw and ball bathtubs that I find very beautiful objects. And so with that in mind, I started developing the concept. Here's one of the original rough sketches I had, exploring this idea of lifting a claw and ball bathtub up on stilts and then having the bathtub legs articulated as if in motion, as if walking, and then tethered with rope to what appears to be wooden stilts that then place the bathtubs up somewhere around 25 feet in the air, far out of reach of people, but also up high at the level of the boughs of trees, so that as people walk through this plaza area, it would be a bit like walking through, I imagine, a wooded area where you can move through the trunks of trees. Some of the questions that came up last night involved navigating the space with bicycles and pedestrians and being able to still set up booths in different contexts for various different festivals. Well, this arrangement was intended to be flexible enough to accommodate that kind of thing, but also creating an environment that puts a familiar object in an unfamiliar situation that gives us an opportunity to see things fresh. The bathtubs that were used in steamliners and in old ships were filled with salt water. This was a picture I saw at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco as I was researching this piece, and when I found out that they were using the seawater, it reminded me of how, with contemporary technology, we are in a way interacting with an object to create a sense of tide. So when people were in this ship, they're filling up and draining away the bathtub. They're playing the role of the moon and bringing in the tides. It's just part of this imaginative journey that I was playing with. The other concern that came up was this whole idea of people potentially bumping into these stilts with cars or other things. And I was suggesting that perhaps we could look to a similar solution that you have used throughout the city, working with the local high school to build these beautiful benches, and we could position something like these if we couldn't actually get these benches to help encourage people to move around the uprights of the sculptures. To create the piece, what I'd like to do is to work with local Petaluma residents to collect 5 specimens, 5 different bathtubs of different sizes, and I would use those bathtubs to create the sculpture itself. The reason why I'm showing this piece, this is one of the pieces I created in Sacramento, and I worked with local residents there to collect over 1,500 suitcases, all of which were donated to me or purchased at a very low rate, but many of these suitcases had little objects in them when they were given to me, sometimes eyeglasses, sometimes an old pair of socks, but sometimes also maybe an opera ticket from the 20s or something like that. They seemed to create a kind of series of portraits. And I liked the way in which these objects spoke of the people who owned them in the past. And so I imagined that the same might be possible if I worked with the local community to find bathtubs that I could use as models for this piece. And early on, I created a project that some of you might have had a chance to see in San Francisco called Defenestration. And for that, I had my first opportunity to work with a bathtub that was part of a sculptural installation. And at first, when I was installing this piece, there was great resistance to the project. When I was up on a boom lift installing elements of this sculpture, people were putting up signs in the windows across the street from us saying, get out of our neighborhood, you crazy artists. And at one point, one of the neighbors called the fire department, and the fire department came and removed the bathtub along with a lot of other pieces until I pointed out to them that I had a permit and everything was going to be okay. So they asked me in the future to make sure that I showed them the permit before I actually started installing. I didn't realize I needed to work that out with the fire department, but now I know. That was back in 1997 when I was starting out. But I imagine people may have some of these bathtubs out in their backyard, or maybe they're being used for a trough, or maybe they are forlorn, but they're ready to be incorporated into a public art project that then would be built in San Francisco. And then what I'd like to do is work with a local sailor, and I'm working on potentially being able to work with the Alma to bring the sculpture that I designed and built for you up following this path from San Francisco to Petaluma along the Petaluma River, using one of the same boats that helped build Petaluma in the first place. And then the bathtubs themselves have many different relationships for me to the site as well as the materiality. I mean, this connection to the relationship between an animal and animals that are very important to Petaluma, like chickens, are very subtle in this case. I mean, you can see that there may be some references there, but they're very subtle, and that was one of the other points that a number of people made to me, is they wanted me to go beyond this whole notion of commemorating the heritage of the incubator and the chicken. So it's so on some levels it addresses it while also building on that notion. And so here's another perspective, but I wanted to show you also what it would look like at night. I was speaking with my good friend Mike, who's here tonight from Holly Solar, and we collaborated to figure out how to illuminate the piece at night. And this is one depiction that I wanted to show you. I'm working on different ideas how it could be lit. It could also incorporate some lighting inside of the tubs, or potentially light coming out of the faucet. But my favorite is to have most of the light emanating from the ground level and pointing up at the piece, and then potentially painting the exterior of each of these tubs with a color that is related to the heritage of the architecture of that era, of the Victorian era. So here's a sample of that kind of palette. So some of the questions that had come up in the past related to this project involved trying to understand why I would put a bathtub in a public art project. And so in order to kind of walk through it or show you how I was thinking about it, I thought we could look at some of these ideas. But as I mentioned before, familiar objects such as a bathtub in an unfamiliar setting gets people to think outside of expected norms. The unexpected nature of the artwork will trigger the imaginations of the residents and visitors to Petaluma. It explores, it's an exploration of boundaries, and the juxtaposition will be memorable in a positive way. These are all things that came up as I was working on the piece, but also compositionally, I was interested in the way in which these tubs start to metaphorically take on the role of the cattle that may have grazed along the river when Vallejo had his ranch right there. So if you, I know some of you are laughing, perhaps this is funny, and I'm glad that it's funny, but it also, for me, is, it's a dreamlike process, and where my imagination goes, I often follow. So if you imagine looking at a hill and you see livestock up on this hill, I am replacing in my mind the hill with these stilts and the livestock with these bathtubs. And the relationship to the from the bathtub to the architecture, but also to the way in which these bathtubs have still been appreciated as objects kept around, despite the fact that many times they have outlived their usefulness in their original purpose, but they're reused, repurposed in agriculture as planters, as water troughs, exactly. And then back to the trestles. So what do the tubs have to do with Petaluma? reluctantly put this together because I was asked this a number of times, and it's not my favorite thing to tell people why something is selected. But I wanted to show you that you can build relationships between these tubs and Petaluma, the whole context of the work and Petaluma, but it's a bit like meeting a person that you've never met before. It might take more than one meeting to get to know them and to start to build your own relationship with what this piece means. What I can tell you is that I've earnestly gone through a process that takes your site, your people, your history very seriously, and I'm making the best attempt to show you the piece that I'm most passionate about and I feel is the strongest work. And the stilts I've already kind of talked about. Let's see. So I think that concludes the journey of this piece. And so now if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to pass this microphone off to you, and I can take the other microphone and do my best to answer any questions that you might have or concerns. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi. Mark Malmberg. I'm from Upham Street in the downtown area.
Hello? All right, here we go. Proximity effect.
So first of all, thank you for the presentation, all the slides, the history lesson, fun bunch of information. Obviously, you've gone through a lot of thought process in these pieces. Second, I've seen your work over the years. A lot of your pieces, either in person or in print, done a lot of very creative, exciting pieces.
Thank you.
I have respect for you as an artist, and so anything I say, please keep that in mind. I have just a couple of comments about how the work strikes me, and then a comment or question or two for the committee. For me, I don't get all of the well thought out connections that you've talked about, and replacing hills with stilts and cows with bathtubs doesn't connect for me, right? So while you have a lot of thought process behind it, I don't get it from the piece. Secondly, I see the need that we have is for, as you described, something that invites people to be there and to gather and be comfortable there. But the piece strikes me as kind of threatening and towering and dangerous. It looks like it might fall on me. It kind of reminds me of creatures from the War of the Worlds, with on their big legs high above. So from a kind of I don't know if it's sociological, psychological, whatever, it doesn't seem like a friendly, warm, inviting place to me. My second, and again, I like a lot of your work. This feels to me like one of your pieces kind of imposed on a space that's really special and a really special part of town. And I don't get the connection of the piece to that place. For the committee, first of all, I have great appreciation for all the work that's gone into this process. I know it's been a long process. I know it hasn't been easy. And I know that we're at a point now where there's a lot of contention, and am I understating? But I want to just question whether some basic assumptions that were made at the beginning of this process might have been not quite right. And this is just from my personal thought process. I would have started the thought process in what does the town need, and not necessarily thinking it's going to be a sculpture. public art doesn't have to be a sculpture. It can be very functional. You know, a lot of public art RFQs are for things like a bicycle, shelter, or painting utility boxes, or things that are very functionally oriented. Water management projects and that sort of thing. So I would have approached this more from what does that waterfront area really need, and from a kind of a standpoint of beautification. That dealing with the trestle would be first order business, and that would underlie kind of the whole thought process there, first of all. And then I would think that incorporating seating and gathering places that were specifically designed, shelters or whatever, that people could really gather there, would be kind of a high priority. So that's just my feedback. Thank you.
Addressing the concern about safety, I want to assure you all that I have a lot of experience working with structural engineers, and I go through a rigorous design process to make sure that whatever I do meets the same kind of standards. Any building that has to pass permitting processes in whatever city I'm working in, and so I've already shown this to my structural engineer, and we figured out a method to construct the piece that is totally safe. And if you don't mind, I prefer to keep it a bit mysterious so that the whole wonder associated with the work isn't completely destroyed. But if you really want to know how it's built, just see me afterwards and we can talk about it, okay?
Can I ask you to pass that around?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sue Bates Pintar, and closer?
Yeah, real close.
Kissing this thing. And were there any other art pieces that you thought would be also considered?
Well, what I had to do was, in order for me to produce a proposal, I had to make choices to decide on the direction that I was going to go in. And so once I went through the initial research process and I had brainstormed and I'd come up with a number of different ideas, the one that really seemed the strongest was this one. So I invested all of my time in developing this for you.
So there was nothing else that was presented to the committee?
No.
And is this a done deal?
This is a draft concept at this stage. So right now we are showing you the draft concept and looking for feedback as the Arts Committee then decides what to do next.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Can I just say something here, if you wouldn't mind?
Thanks. My name's Terry Murphy.
Hi, Terry.
Make it real quick. I would echo what this young man said, the first speaker. Almost. I want to echo what this young man said, pretty much. By the way, I love that piece in the city. The furniture, I admire that thing. That's beautiful. Climbing out of the building, beautiful work.
Thank you.
And I like the kind of walking aspect of this, and I don't have any safety concerns, really. Just the tubs is a specious thing to me. I'm not getting the tubs, and the idea that tubs in the air would make people's mind, expand. And well, we're pretty bright folks around here. I don't know if we need the tubs to do that. But anyway, mostly it's the tubs, and your attempt to sort of connect tubs, Petaluma and the river. I don't understand how any city in the world has anything more or less to do with tubs than Petaluma. So it's kind of an odd thing. Otherwise, again, I want to repeat, I think your work is pretty cool. Just a lot of problems with it so far. Thank you.
Okay, let's see, I'm trying to figure out, Was there a question in there, or? No. Okay. All right.
I was here also last night and heard a lot of the comments and the questions, and while I think this is a really interesting piece, one of the things that came up last night is this is not an open space. This is a really closed space with a lot of visual noise already, with the trellis and the cobblestones and the closed buildings, and your rendering makes it look like it's a much more open space than it actually is. So with all of that, it adds so much more visual noise, and some of the things that came up last night is perhaps having it be in a more open space, like the McNear Peninsula, for instance, which you had up there as an example of the, what is it called, the boat parade that we have there, the festival that we have there, which would be amazing. People would dance around it and it would just be amazing, and I think it would be really cool. But this is not the open space that you have. It's a really interesting project, but not for this location necessarily, is my feeling about it.
Part of the reason why I was looking to lift the sculpture up in the air was to place it in a part of the space that wasn't cluttered up in the sky. So I was just down there looking at it this afternoon, and I heard that comment. I listened to you. I heard everything that was said last night, and I hear you all tonight. But maybe it would be good if we could meet down there and you could show me all the clutter in the air, because it really looks pretty clear down there to me. Yeah, but I'm putting the piece. Well, but okay, so the comment up here is, well, but you're putting clutter in the air. But I am designing a piece that I am hoping will not be seen as clutter, but instead be appreciated as a creative expression. And these creative expressions may not necessarily have to mean just one thing, but this whole idea that I'm putting a tub up in the air to get you to think anything is wrong. I'm not trying to get you to do anything. What I'm doing instead is I'm creating an image that I feel puts me in a position where I am starting to reflect and I'm starting to see things fresh. And I work with, as both. As an artist, I will look at the work and try to appreciate what it is like to live with a piece, to interact with the piece, and to grow with the piece. And if the piece doesn't have a long tail of interest for me, then I put it aside and try to work on something else that feels like it contains a mystery to it. And so for this, for me, it's helpful that it's hard to peg down what this piece means, because it opens it up for the people who live with it to really find out what it means to each individual person, if a piece means anything at all. Because ultimately, sometimes it's important for me to create a piece that has a character that's perhaps more like a tree or a mountain that has no meaning, but it has an ability to create a setting or an environment that we can reflect on and hopefully interact with and have a meaningful relationship with.
Do you think the dialogue of this piece is really clear with the viewer?
The question is, do I think that the dialogue is clear? And
between the piece and the viewer.
Between the piece and the viewer, sorry.
Yeah, no,
Okay. So, yes, I understand and appreciate your question. And yeah, I do feel that the piece reads well. I feel that the piece has a openness to a dialogue, and I think that in part we're seeing that kind of dialogue in action today and yesterday, and I know that there have been people corresponding with each other about this, and so it seems like that's a healthy thing for we who may feel differently about various different things to be communicating with each other rather than isolating from one another. So I'm hoping that the dialogues can continue. We don't always have to necessarily agree with each other to have meaningful dialogue. And so I'm hoping that I can be part of a positive dialogue and invited, and I appreciate being invited into your community to reflect on this piece.
Hi.
Hi.
Firstly, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to explain the piece to us. I don't think that's totally necessary of an artist, and I appreciate that. And I think this is good to have dialogue. From my experience, I've served time on the Public Art Committee as a liaison to planning and parks, and I did my time knowing the process. And this process is really a long string of events that leads to right now. So it may seem like it's coming out of nowhere, but literally I've watched us vote for the collection of this money. I've watched the money get collected. I've watched the money sit there. And I've watched a lot of communities around us develop incredible portfolios of public art. I think if we look at Santa Rosa, a lot of spots you look at up there, you're going to think, wow, that's really out of context. And then you become familiar with it, and it becomes an identifying marker of a neighborhood. It becomes something you see in the landscape. And we did, as a community, invite this in. We asked for public art, and a lot of our public art has kind of become things that people do on their own. If you look around, you'll see some of the Amiano sculptures appearing now in town. You'll see the River House has that sculpture in front of it that Larry did, that he gifted pretty much to our community so we could have public art. And so I think a big part of public art is also contention. I've watched it in San Francisco, I've watched it here. Pretty much anything that happens in Petaluma happens with a boatload of contention. And it does create powerful things. And I think we have to look at this as another opportunity for a powerful thing. But it is something, I know when I was reading Nextdoor and I was reading the explosions I started seeing on Facebook, I felt like I had to come here and say, hey, I want art. Like, I want it now. I want art everywhere. So we have to decide as a community, if this is what we want, move towards consensus and see what we want and be very clear, and then let it go. Because as an artist, separate from other things, I want some space to be creative. And if we completely own somebody else's voice, we're not going to get an authentic piece. So there's a number of components here that I think we have to consider. And for me personally, I see this as very whimsical. I see there's room for things to get a little closer to where people feel safe. But for me personally, I want art. So I'm here to say I want art. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that.
He's been waiting over there a while.
Hello. Hi. I appreciate it. I grew up in San Francisco, and I've been an ironworker for years. And retrofitted all the bridges and skyscrapers I've built, so many buildings. And now I'm retired. And so my name is Brian Mulrooney. And since I've lived in Petaluma for 18 years, and right now, I have a trauma brain injury. I've been doing artwork since I was a child. And so anyway, I started building birdhouses, bat houses, and mailboxes to keep my brain function, all the time. So I successfully started selling them, farmers market and at local art fairs. So until pro bono, my shop, I volunteer fully with Petaluma People Services and the fire department for free and whatever they need. And so with everything I do it for free, because basically what happened to me, I was fulfilled with whatever I needed. So what I did bring down was pictures of birdhouses, bird bat, and outboxes I made. So I was just wanting to show people if I can just be a part of an artist, adding to like even what you would want to do.
Maybe
just
you
to
could
be a part.
show me at the end of the
to help, not to take any part of anything that any other artists would like to add, I'd like to help and work with other artists just to be a part of it, because I love working around Petaluma. Yeah, I built that movie theater. I built the movie theater downtown here and worked on the bridges around here. So, but anyway, yeah, I'm a cost-free artist. But thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
This lady's been waiting a long time over here.
My voice is really loud, so y'all better get that microphone.
I wasn't here last night, so I'm new to Petaluma. I've just been here a year. Closer, yeah, okay. Anyway, I love public art, and there's parts of this that I think are fabulous. I love the light, and I like that it's on stilts, and I actually like the location of it. I feel the same way about the bathtubs. I'm not the artist, so I don't have that association that you do. My friends have large ranches. They have cattle and horses, and there are bathtubs that they use that are old and they're outside. But for me, that part of it seems a little dangerous. Like, I really don't like something heavy over my head that I'm going to walk through, but that's just my personal thing. And I guess I kind of feel like, art is an interpretation. Nobody understood Van Gogh either, right? They never got him when he came out with stuff. But, it has to kind of work for the community. It's not just about it working for you as an artist and your interpretation. And part of it for me, like if I think of cows, I'm thinking about like anodized aluminum troughs or something. That these animals, they drink and stuff. It's not really out of a porcelain bathtub. So I think, I'm not really sure where this project is. Is it a go? Are you asking our permission? I'm not really sure at what stage this is at. Are we here because we're voting on it? Pros and cons? But I would say, I like art. I like that it's elevated, and I like the light.
Good to see you.
Well, speaking about the whole idea of the bathtubs again, the bathtubs are not meant to just symbolize a trough. They're not meant to just show harnessing of tides. They're not just indicating or relating to the many different generations of Petaluma residents that may have used this object or interacted with this object. But it's, for me, an image that perhaps might be similar to an image that comes up in a poem. And sometimes it takes me reading a poem many times, sometimes a lifetime of reading a poem to find different ways of interpreting that poem, and the images, they have different kind of resonance depending on my mood, my history up to that point, the people that I might have been interacting with. And so my hope is that this image creates an opportunity for a multitude of interpretations rather than meaning just one specific thing. The whole the relationship again with the engineering of whether this is going to be a danger if you walk underneath it. The piece itself will be built in a safe manner. Again, if you're very concerned about the weight issue and you want to talk to me about it later, I'd be happy to go through my engineering plans, but I'd rather not go too deep into exactly how I would be building the piece, just to keep that sense of mystery. But what I'd like to do is to have each of these tubs unique in size and shape, so that they don't just look like they're exactly the same. There would be color and form that that would be varied in all of these pieces. And so if you step away from it and you look at it from an aesthetic perspective and forget that it's a bathtub for a while, I'm going to try to create a composition that has a sense of beauty in and of itself. And then seeing that there are bathtubs in there is raising perhaps some questions, but I don't know about you, but I find these objects very beautiful. I mean, they've taken an incredible amount of craft to create them, and they have not been forgotten to time for a reason. Why do we keep them around when almost every other appliance from that era is gone? So this kind of long-lasting appreciation for an object, for me, has meaning. But I see my work as related to a line of artists that use assemblage, like David Best, who's here and who's one of my favorite artists. He's a local Petaluma resident who's been working with found objects to create incredible art pieces. I mean, each of those individual components that makes up David's pieces may have meaning for him, but it's for us to reflect on when we see his work, to find and build meaning in our interaction with those works. And I find that David's work brings me to a place where I'm able to develop my own relationship with the work, and I'm hoping that I can live up to that kind of tradition here in Petaluma for you guys.
So before we go, we continue, I just wanted to let everyone know it is 8 o'clock. The staff are here. They're going to be cleaning up, but at some point they're going to hope to go home and put the chairs away. So there's a hand in the back here. I want to hit that and then come back up the front. So if you have any, if you've already spoken, please, if you can chat with us afterwards in person, but just be mindful of the time, if you will, and to the point.
Good evening. Just a couple comments and two very specific questions. I agree, I don't think it's the right place. It's too crowded. I think out on the landing would be much nicer. I would also think that if it was a 6-month installation and it changed, it would feel different to me. I am lost like the first gentleman on the tubs. I don't get it. Those are the comments. Two questions is one about the lights, and it's a curiosity question. Builders can't have uplights. So what kind of position are we putting the city into for uplights? And the other one is a prestigious question. What is the plan for making sure no one climbs up the stilts?
There are that you can be amazing. I know a lot about it.
Brian, can you answer the second question first?
Yeah, so I am a climber. I climb mountains and rocks, and I also climb in a climbing gym, and I try to create sculptures that are difficult to climb. I try to climb them myself, and one of the things that makes it hard to climb a pole is having a square pole. If any of you have ever tried to climb up a narrow, square pole, it's really difficult to get a grip. I haven't been able to do it, and I can climb very challenging climbs. I've had friends of mine try to climb up these kinds of square poles who can climb, 12 Bs, which is a high rating in the climbing gym. And so I feel confident that the method that I would design these pieces would be very difficult to climb. Nothing's impossible to climb. Any building in Petaluma can be climbed. So, if somebody really wants to find a way to climb it, they can probably throw up a grappling chain and get a rope and get themselves up there. They could put a ladder up there. I mean, there are so many different things. People can shoot guns at artwork. They can slam it with a sledgehammer. But that's vandalism, and it just doesn't seem like we can prepare for the worst case scenario. If somebody wants to create that kind of damage to an object, it's really hard to completely stop them. But what I will do is I'll design the piece so even if it is treated poorly like that, it'll survive and it will still stand and it won't create a hazard for anybody. Was there another question?
Yes, about lighting. I appreciate the question. I don't have a specific answer, but I think
Builders cannot lights going up or light pollution up. And so it puts the city in a position where it can donate it in one spot, but not donate it in other spots.
Okay, thank you for clarifying where that was coming from. I know it was a building code issue or a zoning code issue. It sounds like a zoning code issue. It sounds like a zoning code issue in terms of downward facing shielded light and light pollution. Understood.
Light pollution.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Yes, thank you for the comment. We're just reviewing the concept, so we'll take that into consideration. Thank you.
Well, and one other thing, Mike and I talked about how to try to minimize the light pollution. So there are different ways to focus the beams of light so that they can focus on an object rather than all around the object. So we would be working with that kind of an idea to try to mask it, to focus the light in the place that we really want it. So what you're getting isn't necessarily light shining up, creating a bunch of pollution, but instead you're going to be seeing reflected light off of the tub itself.
Hi, I'm right here.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name is Sarah Sass, and thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. I have seen your artwork at Sacramento Airport since I was a little girl, and I kind of just got the concept, and I loved it. Those suitcases have traveled a million miles together, and I love it. I am shocked at your presentation this evening, and it just really seems like you get Petaluma. I moved here 16 years ago, and I love it. And I am very impressed at how much research you've done, and it really does seem like you get the vibe of the town and how important it is and how unique this little tiny town is, and why we are so passionate and contentious about everything in this town, because we just all feel so passionate and protective of our little tiny island of the town. And I gotta say, I really feel like you get it. And I own a little barbershop right in front, so that where that light pole is, I own a barbershop right in front of that building. And I'm always educating people on the history of the town, the history of the buildings, the iron fronts. So when this art piece goes forward, or whatever art piece you do, I appreciate you being so thorough, and I know that very intricately detailing and explaining where you came up with your artistic design kind of ruins the art in some way. You know, it's not fair to the artist to make you detail everything, but I do appreciate it as an educator of Petaluma, understanding more of the concept. But I also spent many years as a bartender at that dive bar where the back door opens up to that big open space, and I do think it's a very open space, and I even double checked it before I left this evening to really see how open it was, because I pushed a stroller, I pushed wheelchairs down there, and it was a very big concern to me that I don't want to be like dodging beams as I'm going through it. And I did take a moment to really look at how open that space was, and I do feel as long as there was a clear pathway so that somebody was in a wheelchair, that they could get through it, you know, without dodging it. And it looks like that's what you've done here, but I just wanted to emphasize that point. But the one main concern is about people throwing things into those tubs, and I think you guys discussed that last night about maybe putting a cover over it, but I do think that'd be very important, because every time I talked about this in the barbershop today, everybody said, challenge accepted, you know, and those were nice members of society, not the dive bar 3 a.m. clients, you know, that I know so well too. And I appreciate you explaining about the shape of the supports with the climbing, and I appreciate that, because I did not know that. The other thing is too, is the tallest point in our entire town is our feed mill, and I know people that used to climb that on a regular basis when they would get drunk, and they would climb that as by far the highest thing, and nobody's at a city council meeting telling them to tear down the feed mill. So it's vandalism, it's trespassing, and it's wrong, you know, but just because they climb it doesn't mean that it's evil or wrong. So I do understand that too. A little bit about that. I do also want to take a second to thank the committee members, because I know that it's so much work and you guys are volunteers, and I really appreciate that. And the only other thing that I would say is that they're not just bathtubs, they're clawfoot bathtubs, which is kind of where I think that you're coming with that. And we're so obsessed with chickens in this town. Like, we love our chickens. Even if we don't own chickens, we are obsessed with chickens. So my only input, and I'm not artistic, even 1%, I'm so unartistic. I have to ask friends for paint colors. What if you brought the chicken legs all the way down and made them true clawfoot, so that was like grounding the chicken feet to the ground. That's my only thing, is just making it clawfoot tubs and not bathtubs, just not a random bathtub. That's my only input. Thank you very much. That was longer.
Oh, yeah. The bathtubs will be claw and ball bathtubs, and I will be looking at the original claws from a bathtub and working with those shapes, but those claws on these tubs are like foul. You know, they could be chicken-like. You know, there is a way to.
But you're the artist, so
yeah, I mean that's. But I think that you will be able to see them from the vantage of the ground level, and part of the reason why I would like to have them up high is not only because I think compositionally it's more interesting to have them up at that height, but it's also going to be that much more challenging to get something up inside of those tubs. So I know some people are going to take that as a challenge, but I don't mean it that way. I'm hoping that people don't take it as a challenge, but instead see it as something that can be respected. But if it is an issue, then there are various different ways to mitigate that. The tubs could be created in a way that has something that would prevent things from gathering in the inside. The challenge for me is to create a piece that also looks the way that I'm hoping it will, even if you're looking at it from above. Who knows what the skyline is going to be like in Petaluma in 100 years. Hopefully this piece is going to still be there. I'm going to build it to last for that long or longer. But now we live in an age where there are drones and people can fly up and around this thing and take photographs of it. So wouldn't it be interesting to have it look good even from above? So that's what my hope is, to be able to create the piece so that it still does look believable. I know David Best had a question back there.
She's been waiting a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Let me take one here first.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief. I love art, but I'm a very practical person. So my question might be more for the city. The one thing that hasn't been addressed, you did mention the possibility of covering them for the reasons that people might throw things in them. But let's consider the weather in this town. And I don't know if you're going to build this so that the drains actually are open so that they will drain. And if they do, they'll be draining in a little bit of a torrent along with the leaves, and they'll get clogged and whatever. If they don't drain, they're going to fill up with water and leaves and such. So I wonder what the city's maintenance plan for managing that is going to be, because it will happen.
So, through the process of designing and refining the project, we will look at all of those issues and try to come up with meaningful solutions. So this is a conceptual project proposal at this stage, so I haven't specific answers to exactly how all of these forms will drain, but keep in mind that when the tubs are facing forward, like that one up there, of course that drain is going to serve no practical purpose, even if that drain was open on the back of the tub there. But I could put weep holes in the tub that would enable whatever water would collect in there to drain out in a trickle. And if it is raining, then people will be getting wet if they're standing around the piece, whether there's a little bit of a trickle coming out of the tub or not. So I'm going to try to design it so that it's not creating any kind of attractive nuisance, and so that it's not creating any kind of prank where it's dumping a bunch of water on you. But on the back of the tubs also, if the tubs are leaning towards the back, the water could go through the drain that's existing, and I designed it so that there would be drainage pipes coming out of the back of the baths that in some ways emulate the look of a tail on an animal.
So you obviously haven't lived through torrential rains in Petaluma with clogged drain gutters. So I had a whole series of comments that I brought and printed out from a conversation on Nextdoor. where we had probably in excess of 250 comments from different people in the community. And I brought a bunch of them to read, but I'm not going to do that because we don't have time. But I thought I'd give you the statistics on this. Out of probably about 250 comments, there were about maybe 70 comments that were neutral. They were commenting on things other people had said. There were probably about 150 comments that were unmitigatedly negative, almost entirely because of bathtubs and the location of a tall structure on the site, echoing all the comments that they made before. And there were a grand total of 10 comments in favor of this, about 5 of which were from people from the committee. So we're dealing with something on the order of about a 15 or 20 to 1 negative view in terms of bathtubs on stilts on Water Street.
Well, I think that these platforms are very helpful for us to have conversations. And I'm hoping that these platforms are able to develop in ways that promote positive conversations all around. Unfortunately, also, the tendency to some of these platforms is to flame people, and so it's easy to gang up on people. And so if one person presents a concept with a negative perspective without giving the person who created the work a chance to present it themselves, then it doesn't really give the artist, in this case me, the opportunity to answer questions, but instead have this opinion developed in large part because of the perspective of somebody who may not appreciate the work being the person who is the one who's presenting the work. And so no matter however we frame things, if we frame them in a negative light, the tendency is going to be, at least for me, to see it initially in a negative light. So I'm asking for you to give it a chance, and you are by coming here, and I appreciate it. I'm not asking you to agree with me about anything, but I'm hoping that you at least understand that I am going through a sincere, earnest process to come up with something that I believe has meaning and resonance, and I'm hoping that you appreciate and want to sponsor.
I think it's really easy to discount all of the voices on
I'm not discounting it.
Well, you just did. And the fact is that those are the public. Those are the people who are going to see this piece of work without you explaining it to them out on the street. So it has to resonate with them whether you're here or not.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that, and I hear you, and I understand the conversation is really valuable, and it's very helpful for people to be able to have these kinds of conversations, and it's part of the reason we have public art, and part of the reason why I like to be involved in creating art in a public context, because it does create an opportunity for people to have a conversation about art, because otherwise we might just be talking about politics all the time. I mean, it's a little welcome break for me, and hopefully it can be a bit of a welcome break for some of you.
Okay, one more has been waiting patiently. It's about 20 after. Been waiting.
This lady has been waiting for a long time.
Well, being the daughter of a congresswoman, I'm happy to cede my time to David Best, but I don't see you. David, come up. So in the meantime, my name is Amy Critchett, and this conversation has so many interesting intersections for me personally and professionally. And, full 100% disclosure, this is one of my favorite people on the planet, and we are honored to have him here in Petaluma. So what I do for my day job is I produce monumental public art in the biggest context possible. David, come here, please.
I'd rather stand.
Okay. The dialogue of the joy of putting public into public art is exactly what we're doing here. And your patience and your appreciation, the way this man articulated that brief, that was, I think, both imposed by the committee as well as created as part of your artistic process, is extraordinary. So bravo to that. So all good points all the way around. The one point I wanted to add to the conversation was part of inviting, through a rigorous process, world-renowned artists into this conversation is another thing that we're inviting into Petaluma is a conversation that will happen globally in the art world. And there is a very robust and very articulate and also very contentious conversation that's happening about what the quality is of public art in other communities. So one point I wanted to make was I hope everyone appreciates the fact that through this process that y'all have gone through, Petaluma is inviting a photo op, a social media opportunity in one way or the other. It won't all be positive. It certainly won't all be negative. But it will demonstrate that Petaluma has opened herself to a rigorous process to create a monumental piece of public art. And we should be proud of that. And thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy.
Hi, Brian. I was selected to do a piece of sculpture at Petaluma as well. It's public art. It's not my art that I do in my studio. It's public art. The plumber, the truck driver, the person that works at Van Bever, the museum director, they all have an opinion and has to be respected. I live here in Petaluma, and I don't really think of intellectual art as being something that I do. I'm not a deep thinker. But I think it's really important. I think you have a real opportunity in front of you to listen to these people and go with what the community wants. If you can embrace that, if you ask the community, what do you guys want? I'm sure when I step up with my drawings, I'm expecting to get slammed. I think that's a good responsibility for our community to criticize and critique your work. If you're willing to take that criticism and that critique and go forward. It's a real pain in the ass, but I think if you can listen to these people, you'll benefit from it, and we'll benefit from you listening.
Thanks, David.
So we take one more. We're approaching 8:30, and you've been very patient. So thank you.
Hi, my name's Teresa Meeple, and I've lived here for 20 years. And I appreciate your explaining your thought process, because to me it sounded to me like you're following our path towards urbanization. And I know my perspective is shared by many that what we love about Petaluma is that we can tie our urbanization back into nature. And for that reason, I really enjoyed the suggestion about making bird habitats. We have quite a problem with rats on the waterfront. Maybe we could make owl habitats into these structures. The second part of my comment is really a question for the city, and it is lovely. I'm not sure this is the right place for it. I love the idea about having it on McNair Peninsula, along with the Rivertown Revival. If we try it out here, and it doesn't really work, can we move it to McNair Peninsula in the future? That's my question.
Well, I will address the first part as a question of physics. Yes, it could be moved. Should it be moved? I think is another question. Could it go to the McNair Peninsula? The current answer is no. It's It's not city-owned property, it's open space. So that question has been floated for other artworks, and that has been the answer at this point in time. And there should be different ownership and a different purpose that your elected officials, assign to it, maybe, but not today. So I think with that, we should say thank you to everyone. Again, this is not the end. This is the process. We're in stream. We're at a draft concept. If you want to come out and continue to participate, May 24th is the next regular committee meeting. 6 o'clock, the Art Center. If I'm getting the sense there'll be a large attendance, we might change the venue to somewhere else that's bigger, perhaps City Hall. But again, if you want to, thank you for coming out, everybody.